Good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome to our fourth educational support webinar this year. In the earlier webinars, teachers shared effective practices in their schools that we were able to adapt for our own classrooms. What we believe at the educational support chapter is that when one teacher shares, a few teachers learn, and many more students will benefit. That's how we can continuously improve teaching and learning. For this fourth webinar, we have gathered a small group of on-site audience and invited Dr. Stephen Pan to share insights from cognitive science on how learning works best. Dr. Pan is the assistant professor at the Department of Psychology at NUS, National University of Singapore. He is also director of the Learning Sciences Laboratory at NUS. His research bridges cognitive psychology and education with a focus on learning, memory, and effective teaching. Formerly at the University of California, San Diego, Dr. Pan's work on retrieval practice, desirable difficulties, and learning transfer has been published in top-tier journals including Psychological Science and Journal of Experimental Psychology. So what's going to happen this afternoon is we will first invite Dr. Pan to speak to us for, say, 45 minutes or so. After Dr. Pan's presentation, we have invited Mr. Lim Yuki, Principal Mayflower Secondary School, to join us on the Q&A panel to take some questions. So for now, it just leaves me to invite Dr. Pan to deliver his presentation. Stephen, please. Thanks.
Hey, well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation to speak. Cognitive science tells us about ways to improve learning. Okay, well, presumably we're all here because we are interested in literally ways to help our students learn better, whether it's in the classroom, whether on their own, and for a variety of different subjects. And so my research takes a cognitive psychology, learning science perspective on how to facilitate that. And so we can think about improving learning by first envisioning what the learning process is. In human beings, there has been decades and decades of research, a lot of insights uncovered into literally how learning works, what are the processes occurring in the brain, and so on. And so we can think about the individual, before they have entered into a formal learning situation, what their background knowledge is, what their abilities are. Then during learning, can think about the learning that is occurring over time. There is a learning rate, there is amount of information that is being accumulated, knowledge and understanding is developing. And then afterwards, inevitably, whatever has been learned will tend to be lost over time, or at least become inaccessible through forgetting. And so one of our challenges as educators is to reduce that rate of forgetting, or perhaps find ways to, in a way, rescue prior learning, reactivate it if it has been forgotten or inaccessible. And so when we think about this learning process, that provides a baseline for planning ways to enhance learning. And we can think about three objectives that, as educators, we typically share. We would like to have our students gain knowledge and skills that are long-lasting, durable. So we want them to have strong memories for what they've learned. But it's not just learning that retains over time. We want that learning to have high quality, right? We want it to be well-developed. We want deep understanding. And ideally, if they have deep understanding, that learning should be flexibly applicable, meaning that it's not just limited to the classroom, limited to that particular lesson, but we want our students to be able to use what they've learned in different contexts, in the workplace, in their daily lives, and so on. Okay? So these are three key goals I think many of us are aware of as educators. And the question then is, how do we foster, strong memories, deeper understanding, transfer of knowledge? And so that's the goal in my research lab and the goal of many learning scientists. And cognitive science research has given us a lot of insights in how to promote these optimal learning outcomes. So I want to talk about three broad approaches you may have heard of, but I want to emphasize these because they are what in the cognitive science of learning science research really are among the most promising of approaches, okay? The most effective ways to approach teaching students in a way that promotes memory, understanding, transfer. Certainly there's this idea of active learning, okay, as opposed to passive learning, right? Where the learners, your students are directly engaging with the material, right? They're actually not just receiving information, they're actually interacting with it in some way. Then we have a related approach called generative learning. And that's where the learners are creating connections with the material. They're often developing something, creating something out of the material that they're trying to learn, whether it's coming up with examples or preparing some sort of outline or diagram, retrieving information. They're generating something out of what they're trying to learn. And then there is this framework known as desirable difficulties, which was mentioned briefly earlier. This idea that effective learning strategies tend to be difficult, at least when you use them at the start. They may be more challenging. Your students may complain when they use these strategies, but that's actually a good thing because their struggle, they're making mistakes, they're finding things challenging is actually helping them to learn better over the long term. And that's why we call it desirable difficulties. And you can even see here, maybe it's a little small, but easy learning tends to be forgotten over time, whereas difficult, effortful learning tends to be better over time. Okay, so these are three broad approaches that encompass a variety of learning strategies that cognitive science has found to be quite effective. And I'm going to talk about some of them, and we can sort of categorize these strategies based on where in the learning process they can be implemented. So for example, I'm going to talk about pre-questioning, which is a strategy that is typically before formal instruction has occurred. There's interleave practice, which is a way of arranging learning as it happens. Retrieval practice is a way of recalling information after you have formally learned it. Distributed practice to revisit information over time. And then the combination of retrieval practice and distributed practice is known as successive relearning. These are just a handful of some of the most effective learning strategies that cognitive science research has uncovered. And there are now numerous studies, in some cases, thousands of studies showing how these are beneficial for student learning. So we're going to talk about really 4 of them in detail today. A critical hallmark of all these strategies, they may be active, generative, they may use desirable difficulties. All of the 3 approaches may be encapsulated in these strategies. So that's one of the reasons why we think they're so effective. So some of what I'm going to talk about is covered in this review article that some colleagues and I published a couple of years ago. We called it The Science of Effective Learning with Spacing and Retrieval Practice. This particular article identifies what learning strategies are the most effective across the lifespan and when to use these learning strategies. And actually, when you use a learning strategy can be a strategy in and of itself. And so what I'm about to present is actually in part drawn from this review article where we went and surveyed the literature on what the science of learning says about the most effective ways to learn. And you may see here there's a link there in which if you want to go access the article, you can use that link. I know the slides I think will be available afterwards. Okay. So the first strategy I want to talk about is a strategy that you can use before formal instructional activities called pre-questioning. Sometimes we call it pre-testing. And it involves attempting practice questions literally before formal instruction has occurred. So here's a definition. It's where you give low stakes practice quiz questions or practice questions before formal instruction. So for instance, if I just came into a classroom and asked students a question like this. So, by the way, does anyone know the answer to this question? How many islands does Singapore consider as part of its national territory? Does anyone know the answer to this question? 64 is the correct answer. Very good. So, yes. So that's the pre-question. right? We ask the question. I haven't given you a lesson on this. Now, some of you may have had some prior knowledge or training on this, but for many of you, perhaps this is not very familiar, or maybe you heard about it a long time ago and you don't exactly remember the precise number, but that's a pre-question. You just ask people a question before formal instruction has occurred. Pre-questions typically, or we sometimes call them pretest questions, are commonly answered incorrectly. Okay, people make guesses because they haven't formally learned it. Those guesses may be wrong. Okay, and in typical instructional practice, a teacher may use these kinds of questions, but often in the purposes of formative assessment, trying to just understand what their students know. And that's been done for many, many years. But what emerging research is suggesting is that administering those questions isn't just telling you what the students know or don't know. You can actually use that to promote learning in some ways. You can actually use that to get the students to learn in particular ways. So I'm going to give you an example from a recent study that we conducted right here in Singapore. And I'm going to, for each learning strategy, I'm actually going to give you a detailed example that was conducted in an authentic educational setting, but with different age groups for each example. So this particular example was among the first studies of pre-questioning with very young children, 5 or 6-year-old children at child daycare centers around Singapore. And we wanted to investigate whether this strategy of pre-questioning might help them learn, and particularly learn science texts, age-appropriate texts, and the topics were rocks, cells, and camouflage. Okay, and we compared this approach with other approaches that don't involve any questioning at all. Free drawing and learning objectives were the two approaches we compared this against. And we compared two versions of pre-questioning, and this will be important. So this is the basic design. I'll give more details. I'll walk you through it. So firstly, there were 3 stories that each child had to learn from. But each of those stories, we did something different beforehand. So one of those, we had them engage in 2 questions, and then we told them the answers. The other was pre-question with no feedback, which means that they made guesses and we didn't specifically tell them the answers, but when they listened to the story or the passage, they could learn the answers there. And then a third activity, which there are 2 studies. One study, they did free drawing, and the other study, they were exposed to what we call learning objectives. And so in each of these cases, they did something before listening to a story, and then we measured their understanding. And we gave them a criterial test. And so this is a comparison, an experimental comparison of 3 methods of learning. So pre-question with feedback looked like this. We would give our children a pre-question, actually set of pre-questions, and they could guess the answer to each question. And after they guessed, we would tell them what the answer was. And then we would read them the story. Okay, that's pre-questioning with feedback. That's what we called it. Now, there's also pre-questioning without feedback, where they simply attempted to guess the answer to these questions, and then we read them the story, and they could discover the answers there as well. The other 2 conditions on study 1, it was free drawing, where they simply drew pictures. This is a control activity and listen to the story. Or the learning objectives condition. This is where we told them information about the story they were going to listen to, but they did not have to make any guesses at all. They just listened. Today I'm going to tell you about different kinds of rocks. Okay? It controls for prior sort of exposure in advance of the story. We're giving them information in both pre-questioning and learning objectives, but only with pre-questioning do they have to make a guess. They actually have to actively respond and generate an answer. Learning objective, they just listen, okay? And then they listen to the story, all right? And in all of these cases, after they've done that, we will give them a comprehension test where we'll ask them more questions to probe their knowledge and understanding of rocks, of biological cells, of camouflage. These are all topics that were drawn from a National Geographic age-appropriate book series. Okay, so here are the results of the comprehension test. So let me first show you what happened in study 1. Here's the test performance. So you can see here that if you had our students, our young children engage in pre-questioning with feedback, they scored much better than free drawing, and they scored somewhat better than pre-questioning without feedback. That's what we call a pre-questioning effect. It is the advantage of guessing information before you actually learn about it in a more serious way. In study 2, if you compare to learning objectives, we got the same pattern. So here is an illustration, probably the first illustration of a pre-questioning effect in very young children. Okay. And so we can conclude that, at least from this particular study conducted right here in Singapore, pre-questioning with correct answer feedback is especially potent, especially capable of improving 5- and 6-year-old children's learning from science texts. Okay, so that's one example, one of now a growing series of examples in which we see benefits of pre-questioning among different age groups, from young children, as just shown, all the way through older adults, and for a variety of different materials, ranging from facts to images and other types of categories. Okay, so here we see this pre-questioning effect that cognitive science research suggests might be very helpful. And actually, we have evidence already that it is quite helpful in a variety of circumstances. Now, why does this happen? So this is where those of us who are deeply interested in how learning occurs in the brain, we have been theorizing and exploring different possibilities. And this is a framework that I and a colleague developed to sort of try to explain, to begin trying to explain what is happening. Questioning, it activates certain learning processes that makes learners, students, better able to profit from a subsequent learning opportunity. So when you are forced to guess the answer to a question, that might make you curious. It might make you pay closer attention. It might make you aware of knowledge gaps. And then when the learning opportunity comes around, whether it's feedback that is given to you, or whether it is a lesson or a lecture or a reading assignment, then you learn better from that. And then when it's stage 3, when there's a test, you are better able to do well in the test because you've gone through this process. So that's the theory. So that's a general framework for how pre-questioning may work. I also want to emphasize that pre-questioning appears to exhibit all the hallmarks of those effective learning approaches I talked about earlier. It certainly is active in that it requires learners to engage with the content. They have to think about it and make a response, and that response is generative. It's also difficult in the sense that you have a risk and a very strong likelihood of making mistakes and wrong responses. It's error prone. It can be challenging. You may struggle to come up with a proper guess, but there's accumulating evidence that that can be better for your learning in the long term. Okay, so how could you use pre-questioning in your own teaching? So here are some tips that I've come up with. Firstly, you need those questions. This is a particular challenge with pre-questioning. You need the practice questions. The students often, because they have not been familiar with the material, they can't necessarily make the questions themselves. You need to make them for them. We have a study we recently published, and we found that you can use AI to generate pre-questions in some cases. But in any case, you need to have these questions available firstly. Okay, and then before a lesson or a sign reading, you choose questions that target what you want your students to focus on, what you want them to master, and then you assign those questions. You ask them at the beginning of a class, or you provide an online assignment where before they do the readings, students have to try to guess the answers to these questions. It's very, very crucial with pre-questioning to provide the correct answers. In fact, the whole effect does not work unless they get a chance to learn those correct answers. But the critical thing here is they need to be guessing before they learn the correct answers. You don't just give them the answers, because the effect is dependent on them guessing first, and that activates their ability to learn better from the answers when they are shown. Okay? It's also important to explain to the students what these questions are for. It's not just to test them and for them to achieve a high mark. In fact, that's not what these questions are for. These questions are to be low stakes, practice questions that they just try as a way to promote learning. It's not to measure learning. And of course, they need to learn the correct answers afterwards when you present them. So explaining to the students what these questions are for, or at least presenting them in a way that lets them understand that this is part of a learning opportunity rather than an assessment, I think is very, very crucial. Okay. So overall, the research on pre-questioning is still quite new, but it is very promising in many respects. And I think it illustrates the power of prompting students thinking before learning, asking them these questions, activating their prior knowledge, their curiosity, causing them to pay stronger attention, closer focus. All these are possible beneficial outcomes of pre-questioning. Something you might consider using in your own teaching. So that is very quickly the first strategy I want to emphasize. So now let's turn to retrieval practice, which is another strategy that's actually perhaps better known that you may have heard of, which is also involving practice questions, but after formal learning has already occurred. So this is where you are recalling what has come before. So this is also low stakes practice or quiz questions, but they're given after formal instruction, sort of the opposite of pre-questioning. So for instance, you teach your students about photosynthesis, and then afterwards you ask them to retrieve their memories of what photosynthesis is. Okay. Now, retrieval practice can take on a variety of forms, multiple choice, short answer, fill in the blank. I will add a caveat here, which is that the format may affect how effective it is. And there are different considerations for each format. For example, you use MCQs, you might want to use it in a certain way, which we can discuss if there's time. But there are different ways to implement retrieval practice. Critically, it should not be punitive or impacting grades. That's not the point here. It's practice questions to promote learning, not measure learning. And emerging evidence is showing that retrieval practice can help consolidate learning. So you give students a lesson, you teach them, you give them a lecture, you give them a reading assignment. Afterwards, to help make that learning stick, so to speak, consolidate it in long-term memory, you have them perform retrieval practice. So here is another study that was conducted in an authentic educational setting, in this case with retrieval practice and spelling skills. This is done with collaborators at Tsinghua University in China, in which we went into fourth grade classrooms, and these are students learning English as a second language. And of course, they have to learn how to spell English words. And in this particular study, we had them learn 20 English spelling rules and 16 etymological concepts. There are actually two studies, one for rules, one for these concepts. And we were going to compare retrieval practice with traditional reading-based study, because in these classrooms, when these students are actually learning these rules and concepts, they are learning English at that grade level. They're typically practicing and studying through reading-based methods. They'll get a lesson, and then they will have a reading assignment that helps reinforce that lesson. And we were interested in whether if they did retrieval practice instead, that might be helpful. So here's the design. So they learned spelling rules or concepts. It was a 7-day design. So the first day, the teacher would give the lesson, and then they would practice using retrieval practice or reading. And the very next day, we'd give them a test on their spelling ability. And then after a whole week had passed, we give them another test. And we want to explore their learning over time. These are examples of the materials. So rules included rules like this, a double consonant rule, and etymological knowledge, for example, roots of historical origins of words, right? Different types of spelling knowledge. Now with retrieval practice, it was retrieval practice with the correct answer feedback. And by the way, this is actually a photo of the study actually taking place in one of the fourth grade classrooms. They would learn the rules, and then they would take a practice test, an MCQ practice test in study 1. Where they had to apply what they had learned. And they got feedback afterwards. The teacher would tell them what the correct answers were. In study 2, with etymological knowledge, they would also get MCQ questions on the knowledge that they were trying to learn and then be told the correct answer. So this is practicing recall and actually practicing application, because these are often words that they had not seen before. They had to apply the rules to these new words as a form of retrieval practice, and then they were told the correct answers. Now, in contrast, reading practice, this is a traditional method. They would simply read more about these rules or read an essay about the etymological knowledge. Okay, so this is the typical way that instruction is in these spelling skills occurs in these fourth grade classrooms. And then afterwards, we gave them an application test with new words they had not seen before, and they had to apply what they had learned to identify correct spellings, identify the correct answer. So here are the results. Firstly, study one, which is on spelling rules. You'll see the test results for essentially the very next day, 24 hours later, and 1 week later. And we can see here that 1 day later, retrieval practice has an advantage of close to 10%. And you might think, well, what does that mean in 10% difference? Well, that could be the letter grade difference, approximately, difference between an A and a B. Okay, that's not insubstantial. And 1 week later, in this experiment or this study, there was an even bigger difference, which suggests that, well, firstly, you learn these rules using retrieval practice, you remember them quite well. They don't forget very much. Whereas if you learn them through reading, already not doing as well at 24 hours, and actually you forget more after 1 week. Now, study two is a little less of this dramatic difference, but at 24 hours, we have a retrieval practice advantage, what we call retrieval practice effect. And at 1 week, we also saw that pattern. So here we have evidence that you can use retrieval practice to promote spelling skills, particularly among primary school students learning, in this case, English as a second language. Okay, so here is evidence of a retrieval practice effect. Now, the retrieval practice effect is probably among the most powerful learning strategies that have been uncovered by cognitive science and psychology and memory research in history. It has been shown across the entire lifespan, and the improvements have been shown for pretty much any kind of material, learning material you can think of, from educational texts to lectures to problem-solving procedures. There is a study that has shown a retrieval practice benefit. So if you want to know the most effective learning strategies that have been covered to date, this is one of the candidates for the most powerful. Now, that's not to say it will work in every circumstance, but the evidence is very strong that it can work in many different circumstances. Now, why is this happening? Well, this is, again, where as cognitive scientists, we're very interested in exploring, and we could spend a whole day talking about different theoretical explanations and different empirical results. But critically, just to overview, there seems to be, and I think we're pretty confident in saying that when you are retrieving information, it causes productive processes in the brain. And there are a number of leading accounts. So I'll just show you a couple of the main sort of categories. If you retrieve something from memory, the evidence appears to suggest that it makes those memories more accessible, meaning that you'll be able to recover that memory later on when you need it, possibly because the memory is just strengthened. Every time you recall it, it becomes more entrenched in your memory, more accessible, stronger, resistant to forgetting. Alternatively, it may be elaborated in memory, meaning that it might connect more. Every time you retrieve it, you are enmeshing it in your networks of knowledge. Okay, so your related ideas are being connected with whatever you're trying to retrieve, which strengthens your ability to retrieve it later and may also strengthen your understanding. And then recently, there's the idea that your memory is being updated. It is being transformed and new information is being added to it. It is getting more details that also enable it to be better used in the future. This is not an exhaustive list, and it's a very broad overview, but in terms of the cognitive science of why retrieval practice is enhancing learning, this is an active area of investigation. It clearly does something quite powerful in the brain, and the result is improved long-term memory. And as before, as with pre-questioning, it is also emblematic of a variety of these effective learning approaches. It's certainly active. You are engaging with the material. You are generating responses. And it's also challenging, and often you make mistakes. So in the short term, it is difficult, but in the long term, it can be very, very helpful. Okay. So how do you use retrieval practice in your own teaching? Well, firstly, you also need practice questions. And then you use those practice questions, you give them, after you have an assigned reading or a lecture or whatever, that you want your students to consolidate that information, you give them these practice questions. And after they have attempted those questions, you definitely want to give them some correct answer feedback or study opportunities so they can check their answers. If they discover gaps in their knowledge, they can fill in those gaps and so on. Okay. Now, sometimes you may not have practice questions available, and there are studies showing that if you simply have your students free recall, for instance, they take out a blank sheet of paper and just write down everything they remember about a given topic, that can sometimes be beneficial as well. Okay. Now, one retrieval opportunity for a given topic idea is already very powerful, but there is evidence showing that more opportunities, more retrieval practice attempts can be even more potent. Have them retrieve tomorrow, a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 times, 4 times. That can actually increase the benefits of retrieval practice. And if you retrieve on separate days, separate occasions, that's a technique we call successive relearning. If you want to use successive relearning, you make sure that when your students retrieve, they retrieve each time until they, and maybe a week later, they do it again and again a week after that. That's called successive relearning. They're relearning the information through retrieval, and that can be very, very powerful. So to sum up, the benefits of retrieval practice illustrate the power of strengthening memory, or certainly updating or elaborating on your memory through active recall, harnessing our own ability to recall information. We do it all the time. We think back to something that happened a few days ago, something we heard of. You make that an actual learning approach. You have your students regularly think back. That can be very, very powerful. Okay. I'm going pretty quickly here, but hopefully that's digestible. The third strategy, a set of strategies I want to talk about, are what are called interleaved and distributed practice. So the first two, pre-questioning and retrieval practice, is more like what you should do to help your students learn. Practice questions before, after. Interleaved and distributed practice is more like when you should learn. Okay? And specifically, it's different ways to arrange learning in time. So interleaved practice is an approach of scheduling learning or scheduling learning where you switch between different, usually similar concepts or topics as you learn them, and you switch between them. This is essentially the opposite of what we might call in the learning sciences blocked practice, where you focus on only one concept or topic at a time. So they give me a little more concrete example. This learning strategy, by the way, was first explored in the domain of motor skills. So that's why this is kind of a motor skill example. So say you were learning to play tennis and you learn the forehand, the backhand, volley, or something like that. We call these skills A, B, and C. If you're interleaving, you practice a bit of forehand, practice a bit of backhand, you keep switching. Okay, you're mixing the different skills, concepts, topics. That's the antithesis of block practice, where you focus on one skill or concept at a time. Okay. For a long time, it was thought that you really should focus on one sort of to be mastered topic or concept at a time. Practice makes perfect. Concentrate your efforts. But there are circumstances where you can try this other approach, interleaving, switching. Related scheduling strategy, we call it distributed practice. That's where you spread out learning. You don't focus it all on one time. You, on a given, say you're trying to learn the forehand, you practice it a little bit at some point, and then you come back to it. You revisit it sometime later and sometime after that. Okay, so distributed practice is actually, or sometimes we call it spacing, because you're spacing out your learning over time, is actually a component of interleave practice. If you interleave something, for example, you practice topic or skill A, you won't come back to it until sometime later. That's distributed practice. Okay? So interleave practice, you're mixing a series of topics, concepts, skills, usually related in some way. Distributed practice, you are spreading out practice on a given topic or skill. And so when you have interleaving and distributed practice, you can have them together in a pattern like the one shown here. It is the opposite of blocked practice, where you're focusing on only one particular thing at one time. Sometimes it's a little hard to wrap your head around this. It will make more clear in the example study I'm going to show. So this is a study conducted at the University of California, Los Angeles in undergraduate physics courses, specifically Physics for Life Sciences, which covers topics ranging from electricity, magnetism, and beyond. We conducted this study in 2 sections of the course. They had 3 homework assignments per week, 3 homework sets per week. And so what we're going to do in this study, what we did in this study was we interleaved or blocked the homework assignments. So here's the design. We actually conducted this study twice in the same essentially semester. Weeks 1 through 4 was one iteration, and then weeks 5 through 8 was another iteration. So we had 2 sections of the course. We just call them, section 1 and 2 here, 1 and 2. And in weeks 1 and 4, section 1 had what we call blocked homework, type B, and section 2 had type I or interleaved homework. I'll get into more detail about that in a little bit. And then after that, we gave them a surprise test of their problem-solving ability. And to rule out the possibility that any results we find are unique to section 1 versus section 2, in weeks 5 through 8, we repeated the procedure, but we just flipped the assignment of homework type. So now section 1 got the interleaved homework, section 2 got the blocked homework. And we also gave them another test. And the rest of the semester was not related to this study. So this is a comparison of 2 methods of scheduling homework in physics courses. And this is actually what the schedule or the plan looked like. So let me walk you through it. We had 4 weeks, and each week they had 3 homework assignments, each covering different topics. So 4 weeks assignments and different subjects. The blocked homework schedule is the more traditional one. And so for each assignment, they would get 3 problems on that particular topic. There were several topics, so there would be 3 topics, 3 problems. So for example, topic A, they get 3 problems. Topic B, they get 3 problems. Topic C, they get 3 problems. And they would repeat this pretty much throughout all the assignments. Focus on one problem type at a time. Whereas the interleaved schedule is quite different, right? They have the same problems, but we mix them up. They are mixed up such that no 2 problems are on the same topic. And so then as they practice, every single problem they encounter is on something else. They have to treat it differently. Okay, they can't just repeat what they've done in the prior problems. Okay, and we assign this homework for participation points. So meaning that the students didn't have to worry whether they got the answers correct or not. They simply had to do the homework. So this is the scheduling and the design. You can see that it is very much a version of the example I gave you earlier, in that with interleaving, no 2 problems are on the same subject, at least no 2 adjacent problems. And so what happens is if you practice a problem on topic B, you won't practice again until another assignment. And even within assignments, they may be separated. Topic W is separated by topic U. You are constantly switching. So this homework arrangement has interleaved practice and distributed practice in it. It's an inherent part of the design. And just to give you a little more, here's what homework assignments looks like. Well, firstly, the blocked assignment, you can see problems 1 and 2 are on potential difference, are on the same subject, same topic. Whereas interleaving, each homework assignment, the problems are on different topics, each problem. So for example, problem 1 here is on electric field strength, and then problem 2 is on torque and other things. So it's constantly changing what they have to focus on. We also asked them at the end of each homework assignment how difficult and they thought it was, how well they thought they learned. This gets at the idea of desirable difficulties. And after each of these 4 weeks of 3 homework assignments per week, in most cases, the last week was only 2 assignments, we brought the students in for what we called a review session, and then we gave them a surprise test. And we wanted to see how well they could solve even more difficult problems than they had seen on the homework assignments. So that's the design. And another way of looking at it is like this, where you have blocked homework assignments and interleaved homework assignments. Firstly, I want to just show you how well they did on the homework. So I have mean accuracy, and what we call stage 1 is weeks 1 through 4. Stage 2 is the weeks 5 through 8. You can see that the accuracy in the blocked homework is a bit higher than in the interleaved homework. So the students are getting more correct answers in the blocked homework. They also believe, when we asked them how difficult it was, they felt that the interleaved homework was more difficult, right? Not huge differences among the hundreds of students in these studies, but still there was a higher difficulty ratings for interleaving than blocking. And in terms of judgments of learning, we asked them, how well do you think you learned the topics covered in the homework? The students believe that the blocked homework left them with a better impression of their learning. Okay? So we see here that blocking, non-interleaved, non-distributed ways of doing homework, students are performing better, they think it is less difficult, and they think they've learned more. Right? Now, how about the surprise test? Okay? Okay, students were not warned of this, so this is a true measure of the effect of the homework. They didn't cram or study beforehand. I should say, when we give the surprise exam and the students come into the classroom and we tell them it's a review session, then the lecturer says, actually, it's an exam. No stakes exam. There's always a gasp in the room and the students are not very happy. But we tell them, this is not going to affect your grades. This is just for you to prepare for the midterm. And then they say, oh, okay, fine, we'll try. But you can see the scores are quite low in the blocked case. The median is in the first 4 weeks is less than 0.4. And in the latter stage of the course, where the topics are more difficult later on, they're getting about 20% correct. How about the interleaved homework assignments? A huge difference in both cases. Okay, so it's 0.6, huge difference versus 0.4. And here it's above 0.4, again, a huge difference versus 0.2. So here we see that if you interleave and distribute the homework assignments in terms of the problems on those assignments, that can improve undergraduate students' problem-solving ability. Remember, these tests have even more difficult problems than they've ever seen in the entire class. And the students who had interleave assignments, they were able to do better. Okay. So interleaving and what we call distributed practice spacing effects, they have been observed across different age levels and for a variety of materials, particularly distributed practice. So you can be fairly optimistic that if you use these approaches, particularly distributed practice, it can be quite beneficial for a variety of different materials. Now, why does this happen? Well, for interleaved practice, there are a variety of theoretical accounts, but one that has attracted quite a bit of support in the literature is this idea of what we call discriminative contrast, or being able to learn what distinguishes one particular problem type or topic or skill from the next. Okay, so if you are practicing a homework assignment where there was a question about electric fields and a question about torque and a question about something else, you get to learn because you are practicing different types of materials. So then you just practice one type, and then once you know what to do, you can repeat that strategy on all the practice problems. Here you're forced to constantly switch, constantly think about what makes this problem specific to a given scenario, etc. And that may be one of the sort of special benefits of interleaving. With respect to distributed practice, there's this idea of temporal spacing. So if you see something initially in your homework assignment or on one lesson, and you don't come back to it until some time has passed, then you are forced to, the next time, think back and recall. It's not fresh in your memory. You have to retrieve that information, and that can be a learning opportunity. So in the cognitive science of learning, these are some of the main accounts for why interleaved practice, distributed practice can be useful ways to learn. And also, it's a desirable difficulty. At the very least, it's possibly generative, possibly active, but especially it is more challenging to use. It's more difficult. We even see that in the ratings students give on homework that is interleaved and distributed, but it can be very beneficial in the long term. So how do you use interleaved practice in your own teaching? Well, you choose this is very important. It does not seem to work on all materials interleave practice. It is especially suitable for materials that are similar or confusable in the same domain, maybe in the same lecture, but they're slightly different. Then you interleave them. It's not interleaving your math, physics, biology homework. It's say in physics, there are these set of concepts that are similar. You interleave those, okay? Those are when you have the best chance of interleaving being helpful. You plan out a schedule where the students are switching between those topics as they practice, and then you help your students implement this particular schedule. With these approaches, how you schedule learning, often the biggest difficulty is how to set it up, plan. Students are often quite unable to do this on their own. They're cramming, they're busy, but if the instructor helps them set up what to do, then it can help them implement these approaches. Distributed practice is much the same way. You plan out a schedule for them. In this case, the schedule is where they revisit information. They go back to something. Usually a couple of days later, a couple of weeks later, they should go back to what they're trying to learn multiple times, ideally. It could be across weeks, it could be across months. And when we do that, they could also do something effective like retrieval practice. And then that may benefit their learning over a longer duration than if they cram their learning into one short session. And you, of course, have to help the students implement that particular schedule, whatever they've developed, with your help. And so the benefits of interleaving and distributed practice, I think, highlight the critical importance of how you sequence learning over time. It's not just how you learn, but it's when you learn it, when you plan out your learning activities, whether you can set up in a way that you're going to go back to topics across multiple days, across multiple intervals. And for certain topics that are related and easily confusable, particularly, you could interleave them as well. Okay. So I want to wrap up here by just returning to sort of the bigger picture. I want to emphasize that we, as educators, we're interested in promoting memory and promoting understanding, promoting transfer. And I've given you, for each of these three promising strategies, at least one study that shows evidence that it improved memory, improved understanding to some degree, and there was at least some degree of flexible learning, flexible enough to be applied later on, perhaps after a substantial period of time has passed, and also sometimes where there's new information involved, new words, new problems, and so on. So there's transfer of knowledge as well. And of course, depending on the strategy, you might implement it at different stages of learning process, sometimes before, sometimes during, sometimes after. And these approaches, of course, or strategies, are falling under the umbrella of active learning, generative learning, and desirable difficulties in many cases. So I will finish by leaving you with this sort of final thought before the Q&A, in which I can say that after decades now of learning sciences research, as cognitive scientists focused on education, we can say that active, generative, effortful, desirably difficult strategies, they can improve learning, deepen understanding, enhance transfer, and they can be used in a variety of different settings. Pretty much every classroom, I think there's a possibility of applying these particular strategies that fall under these approaches. And as specific examples I've shown you, when students generate guesses, they retrieve information, they mix up practice, spread out learning, the results can be stronger, deeper, long-lasting learning, long-lasting knowledge, skills, and so on. Okay, I do want to thank, well, of course, everyone here for your attention and for your questions that we'll talk about shortly, but I also want to thank all the collaborators who are part of the studies I just presented. I want to thank the Academy for inviting me to present here, and I will be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
My name is Che Chong. I'm with the Education Support Chapter at AST. Okay, so thanks again, Stephen, for I don't know, there's so many takeaways from your presentation. Now we have come to the Q&A segment of the webinar. Introduce Mr. Lim Yu Ki. Mr. Lim is the principal of Mayflower Secondary School. He was formerly director of Uplift and Education Support Branch. And he also has a keen interest in sciences of learning. Yuki has a master's degree in educational neuroscience from University College London, and specifically the Center of Education Neuroscience. So my first question, Stephen can take it. My first question is to Yuki. Maybe from the school's perspective, share with us some challenges related to teaching and learning that are most common for teachers and students, and perhaps also effective practices that the school have taken that has led to positive results.
All right. Thanks, Che Chong. All right, thank you for having me on this. Learning sciences is something I'm very keen on because I think as educators, we want to have a firm grounding in what we do so that we can be a lot more confident in what we do with our students in terms of pedagogy. So you were asking about what challenges. So I'll speak, of course, in the context of today's content because with all kinds of challenges in schools, right? I think one thing that struck me a lot for students in our learning is that I think we do a lot to teach them what to learn, but I sometimes feel we may not be doing enough to teach them how to learn effectively. We see students who may be brilliant, but sometimes struggle, and students with a lot of confidence in what they're doing, but actually the results don't pan out the way they are. And I think that's quite unfortunate because I think we have done very well in planning a curriculum and developing pedagogical approaches to help deliver that content to them. But how much, especially because I've been in secondary school pretty much my entire educational life, how do you empower the kids also to take ownership of that learning and be effective in their own learning as well? And I think a lot of it will be grounded on some of these learning sciences. How can we also help guide them in this as well so that they can be effective masters at their own learning as well? Then from the perspective of the teachers, it's a bit more broader than that specifically. I think the main challenge we have is time. I think there's so much busyness in our day-to-day work. Much as sometimes I speak to my teachers or my KPs about some of these things, the eyes light up. I think it's very instinctive in us as educators to really want to understand how our children learn. When all the busyness of the day-to-day marking, setting exam papers, especially during this period, just finding a time to absorb some of these ideas that's been surfacing in the research domain that we can then transfer to our work. So, like for example, do you know that research on retrieval practice is 100 years old? The research on space practice or spacing is also 100 years old. But I only came upon these two concepts late last year. I don't know about the rest of you, right? So, and of course, the other challenge I think we have in school is how to translate many of what the scientists are learning in this domain into our classroom domain. I think these are challenges that I think we all face. So what we have done, I'm new to my school, so I can't speak with a lot of confidence about everything. But I think one thing my teachers have done well, there's some work that a team had looked at starting from a couple of years ago, looking at what some of the learning sciences have been teaching us. And there's a very deliberate attempt to help work with our students on annotation. I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with, but it's not just in the context of social studies or humanities or English, but also in the math and sciences as well. And I think that's what Stephen was saying. It's a large part about activating the active learning component of the pedagogical processes and also the generative process where the students have to be very deliberate in thinking through and unpacking what they have been reading, but in their own particular context and not something that teachers given to them. I think that's showing a little bit of positive outcomes in getting students a bit more metacognitively aware of what they're learning. And then something that we tried out this year during the June holiday, I know many of the schools probably have conduct like study skills workshop for Sec 4 students, and no different in our school also. But I think this year we decided to not get another vendor to come down because it's just never seemed to be that effective. So we did it completely in-house. And coincidentally, we brought in retrieval practice and spacing. We taught our students spacing, the concept of spacing, how they can apply it in their own revision. We taught them retrieval practice and how they can do that for their own revision as well. Again, we only just tried this year as a sort of a trial, so I can't say with confidence there are positive results, but the student responses at least were very positive. And I think that's part of an attempt to help our students gain greater ownership of the learning.
So it is not just bring the awareness to teachers. You also bring these concepts to let the students understand that we are doing this so that it will be more beneficial and effective for their learning. The other thing that came out was the mention of time. When I go to schools, when I speak to teachers as well as school leaders, the time reason or factor comes up quite frequently. But I suppose if we take a step back and look at why do we do pre-testing and how do we do retrieval? We are actually investing time to buy more time, to save more time. So for me, a session like this gives me the reasoning, the why behind why we do things so that we can do things more efficiently and also more effectively. Anything to add to Yuki's comment?
Well, I'm so gratified to hear that you're actually trying to spread awareness of retrieval practice and distributed practice or spacing among students. And that probably, one of the biggest challenges actually that we've seen in survey after survey of teachers and students really in a variety of different settings around the world is that we assume in many cases that over the years, our students, as they get older, they have figured out the ways to learn effectively. But we actually find that in the absence of formal instruction, they're just doing things that they intuitively think might work or just repeating whatever they have done before. And there is a lot of room to improve and make their learning better. And so efforts like what you're pursuing at your school, I think, are very, very valuable.
I also hear of not just secondary schools, there are teachers in primary schools who are also starting to do this, including things like we know like focus diffuse mode, right? So they also go into brain breaks and they talked about how the homework can be beneficial. Not just homework is not something seen as a punitive thing or something so that you spend your time meaningfully at home instead of playing. Homework becomes a retrieval practice, opportunity to reinforce the learning. So when the kids understand this from young, they bring with them this learning behavior that's beneficial for forever. Yeah. So before we go on to the questions from the pigeonhole, would there be any questions from the audience here at AST?
Hi, I'm a biology teacher. I'm just wondering whether you could share a little bit more about the interleaf practice, because as I listen to you and I'm trying to connect with my own practice, I hear you when you say interleaf practice means we kind of switch between concepts that have some sort of connection, potential confusion, not something that's very disparate. And therefore, as a teacher, in your studies with, the various groups that you have worked with, I'm wondering, how do the teachers actively plan for something? Like, how do I weave in that notion of interleaf practice in my teaching? I kind of get an idea of distributed. I schedule we got tons of MCQ, right? I schedule the MCQ at certain intervals, but I've always been curious about the interleaf. So I'm just wondering, what suggestions do you have to, to deliberately plan for interleaf practice? Yeah.
Well, thank you for your question. And it's probably one of the most important issues facing anyone wanting to use interleaf practice in the classroom. So really, this is where you need to I would recommend instructors do advanced planning, look at the course materials, and perhaps find the topics or concepts that the students are struggling with. Maybe there are certain biological processes that they may easily confuse. And then you plan, rather than teaching one at a time, you find opportunities to interleave those topics, whether it's in the practice assignments, whether it's in practice quizzes, whether it's in the lesson itself or in the revision opportunities. There isn't right now one sort of absolute ideal perfect way. In fact, I think the studies of interleaf practice in biology are very limited. I can't think of many at this time, so more work needs to be done. But as a general recipe, what I just said, looking through your materials in advance, finding those concepts that are easily confusable, and then developing a plan to interleave them in some way in the teaching. Now, that does sound very broad and maybe a bit vague, But I think that is at least the initial steps for how that could be used in a potentially effective way. I will also caution, though, that I allude to this a little bit, interleave practice and pre-question actually are strategies that are among the newer ones. Retrieval practice, distributed practice, we are in safer ground and saying, you can implement them in a variety of ways, and there are many possible ways in which they could be effective. Interleave practice were a little bit less clear. So what I would say though is if there are certain concepts or topics that are confusable, try that. I start there.
So related to the question, would you say there are more effective interleave practice vis-a-vis less effective interleave practice, or the pseudo interleave practice, people who does the interleave practice but actually not the true, in the truest sense, interleave practice?
Interleave practice tends to be especially beneficial for visual materials, like learning in a geology course to distinguish certain types of physical, for example, structures of rocks versus another type of rock, or certain types of pictures versus another type of picture. There's even some evidence that medical students learning to identify X-ray or certain types of electrocardiogram images, they may do better when they interleave as they are practicing. So these are visual materials. And then there are problem-solving materials, certain types of math problems. There's a physics problem-solving study I presented. Those interleaving seems to be really helpful for. Then there are other materials beyond that, such as those that are primarily text-based. Learning a particular topic in a paragraph form versus another paragraph. Interleaving doesn't seem to be as powerful there. So there's a material issue, and then there's the implementation issue. If you implement interleave practice with materials that are completely unrelated, you interleave your biology, history, chemistry homework, they're not related at all. They're not confusable at all. At least that doesn't seem intuitively likely to be successful. And just in my own research group, we've tried that and we have not found that to be quite effective. So it has to be a certain type of material implemented in a certain way. There isn't still, though, the exact best approach.
It is not just about learning or knowing the strategies. It is when and for whom do we use those strategies on. Okay, cool.
So just to, there's also a question I've always had when I was looking at interleaving. I also suspect that the student also needs to at least have some exposure to the content already, right? You cannot use interleaving to introduce a brand new topic to the child, I would presume, because otherwise there's nothing for them to differentiate from if they don't even have any base content.
I think for certain subjects like math and physics, you can see in the studies I've been conducting, including the one I shown, they had a lecture beforehand. They were taught information and they were taught in a non-interleaved way to begin with so that they could at least get the basics. Then they practice with interleaving. So yes, I think there's something to be said about that. Yeah.
Can I just clarify? Interleaving is not teaching the content. Interleaving is giving the students the opportunity to retrieve the content. It is a scheduling strategy. It is when you schedule to practice and reflect on what you have learned.
So ultimately, it is a scheduling strategy and where you mix between different topics, but it actually could be used when you are teaching. You could teach in an interleaved way. You plan your lecture. I'm going to talk about this concept and I'm going to switch to this one. I'm going to switch to this one. You could theoretically do that, but it is most commonly planned. The evidence is strongest for when you use it for practicing, for a retrieval practice exercise that is you're retrieving in an interleaved way. Each question is on a different topic. That's when it is most typically used. But actually, even researchers themselves who study this particular strategy, they aren't in full agreement exactly how you would define interleaving. Some have it as a much more restricted approach where it's all about looking at examples, and others are expanding and practicing. And there are some that would consider teaching in an interleaved way also examples of interleaving. I'll just add to clarify further. Interleaving has caught on in some areas as being a very interesting learning approach, and you will see online and in teachers' guides examples of, just interleaving, this is what interleaving is, and you just take your lesson and you mix all the topics together. That's not exactly correct. It needs to be much more carefully planned than that.
So interleaving is not always in the purest sense interleaving.
Yeah. I guess
Okay.
one practical way we could do interleaving though is in terms of homework. Because in terms of homework, I think we tend to do block homework. We teach this topic, okay, give homework for this topic. Okay, next topic, then after we give homework for that topic. But perhaps we could think about interleaving questions from previous topics as well. And that also allows us to do distributed practice with the children as well.
But the teacher in the classroom will always think that the block practice should come first, right? The students should be very familiar. If I do addition, I should just block practice my addition until I'm very good. And then later on, when you start teaching me the other derivatives of this thing, then I can begin to interleave.
Well, just to quickly say, there are some suggestions in the literature that maybe you should do that. It's still being investigated how much you should do block than interleave side.
That's where the scientist comes in.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think one of the issue we have is that this is about how to learn better. But one of the struggle we have in schools is about the kids wanting to learn and also having the confidence in the subject itself. So I thought this is something that's important because we talk about interleaving and space practice increasing the difficulty. And once the difficulty is increased, you can see that at least for uni, they want to graduate with good grades, right? Sometimes the kids come into school because they have to come like 10-year education kind of stuff. So when they come into the class, we have a variety of students. Those who wants to learn, I think this will definitely benefit them. But those who are actually struggling with the day-to-day, and the gap is already quite big, you realize that by doing the interleaving and space repetition, it actually increases their desire to not learn. So I think really when we look at the block practice for homework, I think it's really about finding that balance between giving confidence, plus also maybe looking at how to learn better within. So I think that's the struggle I currently have. I know all this works because research has shown, but how to really put in a practice to give the kids the desire to learn because they find that they are competent in the subject. Yeah, this is something I'm not sure whether you all have looked into it.
Thanks, Eugene, for the question. I'm just going to read this question from the Pigeonhole. Some students may find interleaving and space practice more challenging than block practice. How can teachers support them to stay motivated and appreciate the long-term benefits?
So both your point is really well taken, I think, and it's really crucial. And I guess this question from Anonymous is also quite relevant to the same issue in that, yes, it is a really important factor in terms of considering how the students will receive these strategies. And perhaps like eating healthy or studying in an effective way, what is good for you is not necessarily what you might really want to do or is the most enjoyable. And I think with these strategies, it's a recurring theme, desirable difficulties. It is going to be more difficult. Students will find it frustrating. And so how can we deal with that? Well, it's something in my research, we try to, for instance, what we sometimes call de-bias the students by giving them information. Sometimes at the undergraduate level, we even show them, research shows this is good for you, even if you might not like it initially. Sometimes we try to make it more easy in terms of certainly it's low stakes, but we might ease them into the strategies. There are ways to at least make it a bit more palatable, sort of like getting some young children to eat spinach. You have to sort of give them a little bit first, and then maybe they finally get a bit more adjusted, and then they'll be happily eating more of it in the future. And so it's an ongoing challenge. There, to my mind, there isn't one magic sort of way to do it quickly. But your point is well taken. It is more challenging. And as a result, we have to be very careful of when we apply it. Because sometimes it is going to be too difficult and we don't want our students to disengage. So sometimes we actually are more judicious in applying these strategies. We might even use the more ineffective strategies, at least at the beginning, before we sort of fade in, gradually introduce these other approaches.
So if I can add on, this is a perennial question I think that we all struggle with. I mean, here, what we're talking today about the learning sciences is the cognition of learning, but there's also the affective part of learning. And I mean, learning sciences also show a lot about the effects of affective affective domain on the impact of learning, and there's a whole slew of other research there as well. But I also perhaps want to challenge us as teachers to think about how we can apply these strategies, not in necessarily the traditional, like for example, retrieval practice. The example brought here was about testing. Retrieval practice is just any form of practice by the child to retrieve and to regenerate the learning that they had before. And that does not necessarily have to be via pen and paper tests, right? It could be some kind of project that you give them or some kind of play activity that you give them. And the same retrieval practice will happen without having to do a pen and paper test or to write an essay or whatever. So then lies the challenge for us. How do we one aspect of course being making it as low stakes as possible. That of course reduce the effective obstacle that they have to cross. But it's also how to embed the joy of learning. I was just talking to Dr. Nasir about this before the session started. Embed the joy of learning while incorporating these practices as well, so that it still retains that fun, but fun not for sake of fun, but fun because there's strong basis in the cognitive learning aspect of that. And this reminds me of yesterday we had a MOE Work Plan seminar, and we talk about AI and all that, but we're not getting to that. But the key message that we were anchoring yesterday is that AI doesn't take away the humanness of what we do. Science can teach us this much, but it doesn't take away the humanness of what we do in understanding the effective domain of our child. And so there's this quote that I like very much, which I heard on a podcast. There is the science of learning, but there's the craft of teaching. And then determines how good a craftsman we are once we have embedded these sciences, and then we see, knowing our child, how each of them are. Different students have completely different profiles, and then we be the masterful craftsman to know which tool to use when and how. Yeah, I think that's where we need to continually challenge ourselves and to, of course, learn from each other.
So I feel these strategies are not just good for teachers to learn, to understand. Also, we should share and make the students know about such things. I think one more step is to extend this knowledge and learning to our partners in education, the parents. I don't know at which juncture we can do this, so that, because ultimately the students do spend a lot of time with their parents at home, and being partners in education, they can do a lot of help for us. Would you recommend that curricular leaders, IEHQ, factor these learning science interventions into the design of the curriculum and schemes of work, such that teachers on the ground don't reinvent?
I think it's probably that they might come up with their own implementations, maybe intuitively. And well, this is a great question. And what I would personally, as a learning researcher, would say is that if curricular leaders find that these strategies are compatible with their goals, and I would recommend that they look into the literature, and of course those of us who are learning researchers can potentially consult on that. They find that it's compatible, then maybe start by testing those strategies with a limited number of schools or classrooms, and if that is promising, then consider developing it on a wider scale.
Actually, I have a lot of faith and confidence that our colleagues in MOEHQ are into this. It is just that perhaps at the implementation at the school and classroom level, sometimes we may not totally understand or get what it means. For example, when I go to schools and talk to teachers, many people mention retrieval practice. But one retrieval practice is just one type of retrieval practice. When you do retrieval practice, how you do retrieval practice, and to whom you carry out these practices, reaps different benefits, and also and they may not see the immediate benefit from that practice, but sometimes could be how you phrase the questions. Sometimes should be how do you schedule these practices. So I feel teachers we still have quite a bit to learn about what really is behind this new names that are just introduced to us. Yuki mentioned that we are just starting to hear these names popped up, but we have been since 20, 30 years ago when we started teaching. We have always been giving homework. We have always been doing questioning. We have always been doing collaborative learning, group work and all. But we may not understand the science behind this. But now that we do, we can more effectively implement such practices so that we target those benefits that we want to arrive at. Yeah. So there's still a lot for us to learn, I think.
If I can also add on, HQ in terms sets the curriculum, right? They set out the content in which after they have scanned what the industrial needs are, what the higher education needs are, what the curriculum that we need to deliver within our primary and secondary school space. And they also provide some recommendations on pedagogical approaches that we can best adopt to carry out those curriculum. But in terms of the more day-to-day way in which we translate that to the students, I think MOE HQ leaves it to us because they also recognize that there's that final last mile delivery which they cannot tell us.
Yeah,
we cannot tell us that step by step to do this and do that. And then lies, again, come back to reinforcement. This is a curriculum that, based on the HQ scanning, needs to be covered. But how you deliver that, they have to leave to you. They have to leave to us. Sorry, I cannot absorb responsibility. They have to give it to us. I think therein lies how, in leveling our understanding of how some of these sciences, how you can translate that to our day-to-day craft, understanding the curriculum that MOE has planned and designed, the broad pedagogical approaches that they recommend, and then how we take that into the ground.
So that's where professional learning comes into play and collective efficacy, which is our work at AST. Right? Thank you. So, okay, one more question. For pre-questioning, does the type of question specifically under Bloom's taxonomy matter?
So there's some emerging evidence that it can matter in terms of maybe not exactly Bloom's taxonomy, but certainly there's some emerging evidence that higher order questions at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy might be more beneficial in certain circumstances. So if you want, it kind of depends on your learning objective. So if you want the students to learn a particular fact or idea, then perhaps a very basic understand or remember type question might be helpful. But if you want them to learn something more abstract or applicable, then they might need to apply. So you can ask them a question, like, if this happened, how would you solve this problem? That's a higher order question, and they have to guess the answer. And maybe that will be promoting that level of knowledge.
You shared earlier your study with the 5 to 7 year olds. I was a little surprised by the results because I was thinking for pre-questioning to be more effective, the student, the learner, should at least have some prior knowledge before they can reap the full benefit of the pre-questions. But your study showed that even without that much of prior knowledge, it did work for them. So
it worked to some extent, yes. I would just add that it worked best when we gave them the answers right away, which is something that doesn't seem to be as critical with older learners. And so, but in any case, yeah, that was something we were keen to explore, and we did not necessarily expect that it would be effective with such a young age group, but it had some promise, which was very, very exciting to see.
And when you're sharing that, it got me to reflect on some of the things that we have been talking about, good teaching practices. I'm sure we are all in that era where we look at discovery learning. And one of the key concepts of discovery learning is that you don't teach anything first, you just expose them to the material and get them to try to figure things out. And chances are they're going to get it wrong, right? But I guess in the whole process, that is actually pre-questioning also. To get them exposed to material to create something which they have no prior knowledge of. But it's also in a fun way. So I come back again to the effective part, how you can take some of these concepts and translate it in a way that still keeps the effective domain going and keep them engaged. So it doesn't have to be a pen and paper test as a pre-questioning also.
So I was just wondering, for pre-questioning, could it be that because even though they might not have learned the material, but because you expose them to the material beforehand, So when they now cover it a second time, which is during normal lesson, they sort of like have the dots that they can now connect better.
It's like priming for the information to come, correct?
So I thought that could be a reason why they might learn better with the pre-questioning, even though they might not be taught beforehand. This is just my preliminary thought, because I know there are some talks about priming and really about giving them some info behind to read, even though they might not understand. But once they come in the second round, actually they learn better. Yeah.
With my limited knowledge of this field, can we say that this is pre-questioning helping with encoding so that the knowledge sticks better?
I think broadly that's one of the general ideas, but this perspective is actually one of the debates in the literature on pre-questioning and other strategies like it, is that maybe it's almost like helping you scaffold prior the learning to come, in that it might prepare you in some way. Maybe you activate a mental model or something that is going to help you absorb that information better. The other side of it, another perspective, is that it's all about activating your prior knowledge. So it's not clear at this time what is actually happening, but there are at least two major possibilities. Yeah.
Earlier, you also mentioned successive relearning, and this is with feedback, giving the correct answers. So that reminds me that practice really doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent, and practice with feedback makes perfect. Right? So that I wonder if our advice to teachers is, when we do pre-testing, we should always follow that up with feedback, and then we do the proper teaching, and where possible, end of the lesson with some kind of retrieval practice so that they reinforce that learning.
I think that's a very potentially promising approach. I will add, though, with outside of young children, when we use pre-questioning, there's a question of literally whether we need to give them that feedback right away or not. One possibility is you just give them the questions and then they try them, and they have to wait for you to teach them for the answer. And if you tell them the answer right away, that might cut off, at least it's a hypothesis, they might cut off their interest and attention in what happens. So sometimes you give them a question and you say, okay, wait till the lecture to find out the answer. Maybe that might be helpful as well. So there's still different approaches that we need to experiment and explore.
Okay, perhaps one final question to round off this webinar we have. How can teachers account for differences in students' prior knowledge, working memory capacity, or motivation when applying insights from cognitive science to classroom practice?
Okay, this is a really great question, and actually relates to a question that just came before, which was, I think, on strategies that some students might be better at, and it might just help those students more versus the students that are not as able to. Yeah, and here we have a question on, the students' individual differences, literally. Okay, so this is also an active area of research. In fact, in my research group, we sometimes explore this issue where we want to see whether maybe students with higher scores on one cognitive ability measure might benefit more from a strategy versus another. And that raises the question of different outcomes. So sometimes we call it the three possibilities, like rich get richer, where the high ability students just get better and the other ability students, they don't benefit as much. Or another scenario is what we call the rising tide lifts all boats, meaning that everyone just gets better, or that it actually targets the lower ability students and sort of evens the playing field. It helps them more, so then they are similar to the better performing students. And depending on the study currently, it varies. Sometimes you see one pattern, sometimes you see another pattern. So it's not entirely clear, but it is, I think, very likely that it's not one size fits all, that sometimes some students benefit more than others. Okay, so to just say as a quick response, firstly, we know from another perspective I didn't talk about much, cognitive load theory, that we need to think about working memory capacity limits, which we all have, some more than others. So if we design our teaching and learning activities to keep that in mind, that's potentially helpful for everyone, perhaps more for some students than others. But I think ideally, when you implement any strategy, you want to not benefit as many students as possible. So you couch it and you implement it in a way that hopefully will help the struggling students at least in some way, not leave them behind, and possibly help everyone else as well. But ideally, you can do that. It requires sometimes trial and error.
When we look at differentiated instruction, one of the key principles we always have to think about is which dimension are we looking at, right? Whether you're differentiating because of prior knowledge or whether differentiating in terms of motivation or in this particular example, so in terms of working memory, and then you differentiate according to that. And so I think it's in terms of applying the cognitive science, it doesn't deviate from the thinking that we still need to also apply when we think about other aspects of pedagogy, which is, for example, differentiated instruction. So for example, if you want to embed more retrieval practice with your students, you can also differentiate the different kinds of retrieval practice that different students are undergoing depending on their for example, working memory capacity or their motivation. Some students need a more play-based type, where some students you can really literally just get away with pen and paper. So I think that's also how you combine the different considerations across different concepts.
So it is really matching the strategy to the learning gaps experienced by the different students. Okay. So yes, it's about time. It just leaves me now to thank Dr. Stephen Pan as well as Mr. Lim Yu-Ki to join us this afternoon. There is this is Dr. Pan's website. The QR code will bring you to this website where you can find all his research articles free to download. But if you wish to quote any of his studies, please do the needful. And okay, one more group of people to think that that's Soup S3, Mrs. Tan Wee Pin, as well as Mrs. Debbie Chow, VP, Marymount Common School, for the logistics support as well as sponsoring this afternoon's event. And we hope to see you in our webinars in 2026. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.